The story I'm going to tell you is called The Widow's Lazy Daughter, and it's from Ireland. There was once a poor widow who had one daughter who was the laziest girl in all Ireland. The only thing she ever remembered to do was to put a little dish of milk out for the fairies every night beside the back door. And the poor widow had to do the cooking, the cleaning, the scrubbing, and if they needed a few coins to buy things, she had to go into town and get a job. Now, this was a day when she had a job, and she said to her daughter, whose name was Eileen, "Eileen, I am putting our last bit of porridge on to cook. Don't let it burn." And Eileen promised her mother that she would watch it like a hawk, that she would in no way let it burn. And her mother left, and Eileen sat by the fire, and she stirred the pot. And I'm sure she stirred it once, and maybe twice, but then she went into her favorite daydream, which was of she, Eileen, married to the King of Ireland's son, in a wide, wide-skirted dress and rings on every finger. She was unfortunately awakened from this daydream by the smell of something burning. Oh, and it was the porridge. She had just run to the door of the cabin to fan it back and forth to get rid of the smoke, when who should come up the path but her mother. Her mother did not need to sniff twice to know what had happened. She was so angry she grabbed that spoon from her daughter and began to chase her down the street, giving her clouts on the head. But coming up the street on a fine horse was the King of Ireland's son. He said, "My good woman, why is it you are chasing your daughter down the street, and with a spoon?" Now the woman was embarrassed to tell the prince that her daughter was the laziest girl in all Ireland. So she quickly made up a story. She said, "Oh, your highness, I am a poor woman, and my daughter is so hard-working. She loves to spin and weave and knit. I cannot keep her in materials, and it was in that frustration that I was chasing her." "Your daughter loves to work?" said the prince. And the woman said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know, I have been the length and breadth of this country looking for a hard-working girl because my mother will not let me have a lazy bride. May I take her to the palace?" And the woman said, "Certainly," and she gave her daughter a leg up onto the horse. Now, when the queen met the girl, she looked at those lily-white hands, and she said, "This is a hard-working girl? Who told you so?" And her son said, "Her mother did." "Well," said the queen, "we will put her to the test, and if she's not, it's back to her mother she'll go." The next day, Eileen was taken to a room that was filled with bundles of flax, and the queen said to her, "Spin all of this flax into fine linen thread before nightfall, or it's back to your mother you go." Eileen began to cry, and she sat beside the spinning wheel, and she cried, and she cried, and she spun the wheel once or twice, but she didn't know how to use one of those. And when she had made a great puddle on the floor, she went and sat beside the window to cry some more. And a strange little woman looked up at her in a green cape and a red bonnet, and she said, "Why are you crying, Eileen?" Eileen said, "I have to spin all this flax into thread, or it's back to my mother I go, and I don't get to marry the King of Ireland's son." "Do you love him, Eileen?" "Oh, with all my heart. I'd love him if he were the butcher's boy." "Can you make a promise and keep it?" "Well," said Eileen, she had heard those Rumpelstiltskin stories within reason. "Well, if you will invite me to the wedding and let me sit at the high table, I will spin it for you." And the little woman came in the window, and she took a tiny silver spinning wheel out from under her cape and said, "Spin, spin, spin, and when the job is done, I'll get me to the wedding of the king's own son." And they wound bobbin after bobbin of fine linen thread. The woman left, and when the queen came back, whew, she was surprised. She said, "Well, it seems you can spin. Tomorrow we'll see if you can weave." And the next day Eileen was ushered into a room with a great loom already strung with the warps and the wefts. "Spin all that thread into linen cloth, or it's back to your mother you go." And the queen left and locked the door behind her. Eileen began to cry again, and she cried, and she cried, and then she moved to the window, and she cried some more. And there was a second little woman in a green cape and a red bonnet, and she said, "Why are you crying, Eileen? I have to weave all this thread. Can you make a promise?" "I can," said Eileen. And the woman came in, and she took a tiny silver loom and said, "Weave, weave, weave, and when the job is done, I'll get me to the wedding of the king's own son." And they were soon pulling fold after fold of fine linen cloth. When the queen came back that night, she was surprised. "Ha! Seems you can weave. Tomorrow we'll see if you can knit, and if you can, we'll set a date for the wedding." The next day Eileen was taken into a room with balls and balls of white wool. "Knit all of this wool into stockings by nightfall, or back to your mother you go." She handed Eileen a pair of knitting needles and left. And Eileen played with those needles. She clacked them together, but she didn't know what to do with them. And she began to cry, but not too much. And she went over to the window, kept an eye out, and sure enough, a third little woman in a green cape and a red bonnet said, "Why are you crying, Eileen?" And Eileen explained about the knitting, and the little woman asked the favor and came inside. She took those silver knitting needles and said, "Knit, knit, knit, and when the job is done, I'll get me to the wedding of the king's own son." And soon there were pair after pair of perfect white stockings, all strung together on the top. When the queen came back, she looked at those stockings, and she looked at Eileen, for she knew that no mortal woman could knit 100 pairs of stockings in a single day. But she said nothing. And a date was set for the wedding. And when the plans were being made, Eileen came before the king and queen and the prince, and she said, "I have a favor to ask you. I have 3 cousins who have been kinder to me, than I hope you ever know, and I would like to invite them to the wedding." "Of course, my dear," they said. "And can they sit at the high table?" "Certainly." So the day of the wedding came, and Eileen looked beautiful. She had on the dress of her dreams, with ruffles and lace and a wide, wide skirt and rings on every finger. And after the service, there was a great party. And when in the middle of the party, there came a knocking on the door. And the doorman opened it, and the strangest woman came in a green cape and a red bonnet, but with 1 foot, that was twice as large as the others. She was brought up to the head table and introduced to the prince, and the prince said, "No, I really shouldn't ask, but my good woman, where did you get such a large, large foot?" And she said, "From spinning, from pushing the treadle up and down, up and down." "Oh," said the prince. And soon a second woman knocked at the door and came in, and this one had 1 arm that was the usual size, but the other one hung down twice as long. And the prince said, "Oh, my dear, where did you get such a long, long arm?" "From weaving, from throwing the shuttle back and forth and back and forth." "Oh," said the prince. And soon the third woman came in, and she had a nose, that was out to here. And the prince said, "Oh, my good woman, where did you get such a long, long nose?" And she said, "From knitting, from counting the stitches with my nose." And the prince looked at the 3 strange women with the big, big foot and the long, long arm and the long, long nose. And he looked at his beautiful bride. And then he turned to her and he said, "You'll never do another lick of work again as long as you live." "Just as you like, my dear," said Eileen, "just as you like." And as for the king and queen, they thought that having a daughter-in-law who had the blessing of the fairies was even better than having a hard-working girl. And that's the story of the widow's lazy daughter. Thank you. Irish hero Finn. And it's also about his aunt, whose name was Turien. And it is also about a man named Fergus Finlaw, who was the man who in all Ireland hated dogs more than anyone else. When Fergus would see a dog, he would throw stones at it until it ran away. He only employed servants who hated dogs, and if he heard that a man had drowned a litter of puppies, he would go to that man and offer to marry his daughter. Now, Finn was just the opposite. Finn loved dogs. He knew everything about dogs, from the smallest milk tooth to the rocking of the long, last yellow one. He knew what was to be expected of a tail, a nose, a paw, and how much a dog could be trained without losing its honorable qualities. Finn loved all 300 of his dogs, but there were 2, Bran and Scolan, to whom he gave special affection. And if you were to guess for 20 years, you would not guess why, but by the end of this story, you will know. Now time came when Finn and his men, the Fianna, were encamped beside a river, and they were paid a visit by Finn's mother and by her much younger sister Turien. Oh, of Finn's mother there is nothing to be said for her beauty, and of Turien, well, her voice was like the cuckoo, her face shined like the spring, and her form flowed like the river, and every man who saw her wished that that form would flow to him. But it was to a man of Ulster that she gave her heart, whose name was Eowlin. Now when Eowlin came to ask for the Lady Turien's hand in marriage, Finn made a curious stipulation. Either he did not know the men of Ulster well enough, or he knew them all too well. He made Eowlin sign a pact that said if there was ever any reason to think the lady unhappy in her marriage, she would be returned to her family. And Eowlin signed, and so did one of Finn's men, who much would rather have been marrying the Lady Turien himself. Well, the Lady Turien and her husband went off to his stronghold, and they lived happily for a while. But the law of life is change, and Eowyn was a man with a past. He was not exactly ashamed of it. He just thought it was behind him, when in fact it was ready to jump up and block the way to the future. For before he had married, he had been the sweetheart of a woman of fairy, a woman of she, and he had often visited her there and given his lover's whistle to call her, and she would say, "Oh, there is the pulse of my heart, there is the flower of my tree." And then for a long time Eowyn did not come, and the lady of fairy, whose name was Uchtdelv, which means fair breast, she was puzzled. When she heard that he had married another, her heart stopped beating, and she became capable of every ill deed. And she began to plot her revenge in bitter collectedness until she came up with a plan. She disguised herself as Finn's female messenger, the best-known woman in all Ireland, and she went to the keep of Eowyn, and she said, "I have a message from Finn. He will pay you a visit soon." "Oh," said Eowyn, "we will give him an Ulster feast." "And now," she said, "I have a message for your queen." And she and Turien walked into the garden, and when they were out of sight of the house, Uchtdelv took a hazel rod out from under her cape, tapped her, and her form began to whirl and swirl, and Turien turned into a hound. Uchtdelv took a chain and roughly clasped it around the dog's neck and began to drag her away, saying, "Bad girl, stealer of another girl's sweetheart. What would he think of you now if he saw your skinny legs and your long nose and your tail? He would not love you now, bad girl." And she dragged her down the road and said, "Have you heard of Fergus Finlaw, the man who in all Ireland is unfriendliest to a dog?" And indeed, Turien had heard, and she began to shiver, for Uchtdelv did not want a good home for the dog. She wanted the worst home possible. When she came to the castle of Fergus Finlaw, a servant answered the door and said, "You can stay out here with the dog, or you can come in without her." "I come from Finn, and I come in with the dog, or he will hear of it." Now Finn's name opened all doors, and Fergus came down himself, and he said, "It's a dog. Go away and kill her, and when you come back I will give you a present. I bring this dog from Finn. He bids you keep her until he comes for her." "Finn sends me a dog. Finn knows I have no liking of dogs." "I have given you the message, master, and here is the dog. Do you take her or refuse her?" "If I could refuse anything to Finn, it would be a dog, but I can refuse him nothing. Give me the dog." Uchtdelv put the leash in his hand, and she went away, very pleased with her revenge. The dog had not stopped shivering, and the next day Fergus called to his servant. He said, "Has the dog stopped shivering yet? For if it shivers off a leg, Finn will not be pleased." "It has not, master." "Is there any cure for the shivers?" "Well, I have heard if you pick her up and hug her and kiss her." "Hug her and kiss her." "It is only what I have heard, master." "Well, I'd do more than that for Finn." So the dog was brought to Fergus, and he said, "If you put so much as a start of a tooth against a finger," and he reached down and picked her up, and the dog did not snap. And he hugged the dog to his chest, and he began to walk moodily up and down the hall, giving her one hug for every 5 paces. And the dog reached up a shy little tongue and gave him a lick on the chin. "Do not do that again," he said, "now and forever. If it has to be kissed, I'll kiss it. I'd do more than that for Finn." And he brought his lips down to the dog's muzzle, and he gave her a kiss. And the dog began to give little wiggles and yips, and when he put her down, there was not a single shiver left. The dog would not be separated from him. She followed him everywhere. He said, "The dog likes me." And the next day he said, "By my hand, I like the dog." And then he became tormented with the idea that someone would throw a stone at her. And he called all of his servants together, and he told them that this dog was the flower of his tree, the pulse of his heart, and no one should knock even a single shiver out of her. Now about this time, word came to Finn that his aunt was no longer living with her husband, and he called and sent men for the fulfillment of the contract. Eowyn was in a state, for he suspected Uchtdelv had stolen his queen. He begged for time to find her, and Finn said, "Tell the wife loser, I will have my aunt, or I will have his head." And Eowyn set off for Faery. It was hard to get Uchtdelv to see him, but when he did, she said, "What do you want, breaker of hearts?" He said, Finn will have my head. I know you have taken Turien. What if I have? Save me from Finn. Well, she said, if I do save your head from Finn, then your head belongs to me. Isn't that right? And he had to agree that was so. And a head, she said, is not much good without the body that goes under it. So your body belongs to me too. Is that right? And he agreed that would be right. If you promise to be my sweetheart from now until the end of time, I will save you from Finn. And Eowlin agreed. She went back to the keep of Fergus Finlaw and took the hazel rod and tapped the dog, and Turien's own form came back to her. But in the matter of the 2 puppies she had given birth to, nothing could be done, and they must stay as dogs. They were given to Finn, and they were Bran and Skolan, and became the best beloved of all his dogs, for they were as smart as men, as loyal as dogs, and they were his cousins beside. Turien married the man who had loved her so long, and they lived happily ever after he had promised that he was not now, nor had ever been another's sweetheart. Oh, but as for Fergus Finlaw, he took to his bed for a year and a day, suffering from blighted affection, and he would have died there too, had not Finn sent him a special pup. And within a week, that pup was the son of fortune, the flower of his tree, and so he got well too and lived happily ever after. Thank you.
The story I'm going to tell you tonight is about a gift that my aunt gave me, which was the thing that meant home to her more than anything in the world. My great Aunt Nell was a somewhat stern woman. She was the oldest of 5 children. The 2 pretty sisters married. The stalwart brother started his own family. Her youngest brother, who drank just like his father, never amounted to much, and my aunt was left with the care of both of her parents. She saw them through the Depression when they lost their house. She got a college degree. She went as high up in the library system of New Orleans as they let a woman go back then, and she supported her parents for the rest of their lives. When I knew her, she lived in New Orleans, uptown, in a half of a shotgun double, and my mother and I would go visit her. We would take 3 buses from my grandparents' house, where my mother and I shared a room. We would stay all day. And when you walked into her house, there was a smell of furniture polish, of citrus. You would know it anywhere. And when my aunt died, I inherited things from her. I inherited a chair that had been in my family for ages, and that generations of people had been told that they could not sit on it because it would fall down. I inherited so much green glass, little footed dessert dishes, that when my children were ready to move out, I said, fine, you take 8 with you and you can go. I inherited a curved glass china cabinet, full. There was no room for anything I might bring to it. It was already stocked. There was all the little pink glass that you got from the movie theater or inside a detergent box. There were plates. It was one of my favorite things, which is a tin basket that was actually my great-great-grandmother's wedding present. And the person who gave it to her kindly engraved their name on the side, from so-and-so. And I took it to Antiques Roadshow, and I was told, it is not valuable, just old. I inherited many, many family photographs from the 1800s, from the early 1900s, and I have kept them all, but I did not keep the ones. It was a large manila envelope with my Aunt Nell's hand on it saying, photos of people whose names I do not know. And even though I could see that some of those people recurred in the photographs, I couldn't give them storage space along with all the ones that I did know. There was one other telling thing that my mother and I found from my aunt. And it wasn't given to us, it was what we found when we were clearing out her house after her death. In New Orleans, there is a custom, wedding cake charms, almost like a fortune telling. Little half-inch silver charms are buried under the first